Start your day with It's the Business. Here's Phil Dobbie.
Good morning. Today, following on from furlough, when the furlough scheme ends, how many people will find that their job that they've been clinging onto actually doesn't exist anymore? At least 275,000, says Red Flag Alert.
And our most recent version of this data shows that 26 of the companies that made claims in December, and bear in mind that was 741,000 companies used the furlough scheme in December, are showing some signs of extremely poor financial performance.
Dr. Nicola Headlam joins me soon to talk about the need for a more coherent policy on how we get out of lockdown using data, just like we use data with the virus, but business data this time. Plus, the vaccine rollout slows down in Europe, Deliveroo set to list on the London Stock Exchange, and will BT workers go on strike? I mean, imagine, it's the one thing that's holding the country together. If that starts falling apart, we do have an economy which is held together by copper wiring right now, don't we? It's Tuesday, the 16th of March, 2021. Good morning.
And now, it's the business, making sense of it all with Phil Dobbie.
Yes, more on the likely rise in unemployment as furlough ends soon on the podcast, and the need to use data, I should say, to help plan how we come out of lockdown. It's a real problem, I do a podcast every day for Australia. I have to think about saying, because they say data over there. But data, that's how it's said. Look, tomorrow, by the way, how can you prepare your business for reopening if it's been closed by COVID-19? Or it's been scaled back, and you want to get ready for the rush. What if that rush doesn't happen? Maybe you actually need to work to create that business again. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Now, look, there are reports that 3 people have now died from blood clots in Germany, having taken the COVID-19 vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is why many European countries are now stopping using it for a while. This is a move by the EU, or we're going to have the EU. We're going to have to call them, because otherwise the front page of the Express doesn't make sense today. Shameful. What on earth are you playing at? Look, this is pretty much the front page of every newspaper this morning. The Times, UK defends Oxford jab over fears of blood clots. The Telegraph, chaos in EU over Oxford jab concerns. The Guardian, EU regulators dismiss fears over Oxford's vaccine safety. The Mail, reckless EU snubs UK jab. Yeah, we're taking it very personally, aren't we? How dare those Europeans have a go at our vaccine? The clots in the EU are slowing down their vaccine progress. Basically, that's the clots that are happening, not the clots in charge. I would never say such a thing. But look, many countries in Europe have reached less than 11% of the population, whereas we're around 40% and rising quickly. So France, Italy, Germany and Spain, the latest to join the suspension of the AstraZeneca vaccine, even though the World Health Organization's chief scientist has said around 300 million people have had it so far, and there's no documented evidence of anyone having died as a result of it. Whereas in Italy, over 300 people a day are still dying from COVID-19 and rising. Seems like a no-brainer, doesn't it? But maybe this, something happening to the Europeans that is not happening to us. Who knows? I mean, maybe our arteries have become so accustomed to being clogged by the unhealthy food we eat. So really, if you're going to take the AstraZeneca vaccine in Europe, you've got to work on your thin blood. You've got to work up to it. Maybe be a bit more sedentary. Eat large doses of fish and chips. Have a pork pie for lunch and a toasted cheese sandwich midway through the afternoon. And lots of chocolate. Maybe that'll do it for you. And we might be about to get unhealthier still, given that 80% of our fruit comes from overseas, 20% from Spain. We had that 40% drop in exports in January to the EU. I wonder how our imports are going to fare, given the what's the wrangling that is going on between the UK and the EU. We're going to have to basically live off strawberries this summer, so long as you pick it yourself, because there's going to be no workers coming in to do it. Because the EU has launched legal action against the UK over alleged violation of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Brussels said steps by the UK government earlier this month to unilaterally ease trading conditions for Northern Irish businesses amounted to a breach of the two sides' Brexit treaty. So how do you think that relationship with the EU is working out, by the way? It's not looking good, is it? Maybe what could make the situation worse? How about a strike? just when we've got used to home working, and now we're swearing less when our computer webcam doesn't work properly or you get booted out of Zoom for no reason whatsoever. Just as we're getting used to all this stuff, getting used to the use of technology, BT, who are connecting many of us, you don't even have to be a BT customer. Remember, the wires into your home are owned and operated by Openreach. That's BT. So irrespective of who you're using, you're probably dependent on BT. They could well be going on strike. So if something breaks, there's going to be nobody there to fix it. Imagine lockdown with no phone calls, no Zoom calls, no binging on box sets on Netflix. You would have to sit at home and watch daytime TV live. I don't know if you've tried it to see how bad it is, but this could all just be a bit of mouthing off. Dave Ward, the CWU's General Secretary, said BT, Openreach and EE staff have been key workers during the pandemic. They've kept the country connected, held together the home working revolution, and enabled the wheels of the economy to keep moving, all while dealing with the realities of the pandemic themselves. Their reward from the BT Group has been the threat of compulsory redundancy or the closure of their workplace. This all amounts to basically BT is wanting to centralise their work into fewer locations, which is sort of inevitable, I think, as they build this new fibre network. Just get on with it. We all want faster broadband. Let's see what happens with this one. Meanwhile, maybe Priti Patel will come along and pass a new law that makes striking illegal. Because, as we talked about yesterday, Priti Patel is pushing ahead with her new bill. Whilst talking about protests at the weekend, she said people shouldn't attend protests. Police were just doing their job. And there's no room for more protesting right now. I do wonder whether is she part of a subversive government plot to remove letters from the alphabet one by one. So she started with the letter G. Just every single G. She never uses the letter G. 26 is a strange number for numbers of letters in the alphabet, isn't it, really? So maybe we could lose one. Maybe down to 25. 20 actually sounds a lot more acceptable, doesn't it? It's a nice round 20. I like to see the letter Q go because, look, if it can't stand on its own, it always needs the U there to support it. So really, that makes it worthless as far as I'm concerned. If you can't stand on your own, there is no room for you in our alphabet. We've been accommodating long enough. I think in these pandemic times, we have to make sacrifices. So what else? W. I mean, that's just two U's. We don't need a W. Just use two U's if you want to use a W. There's another letter saved. We've got why have we got a W? Well, we haven't got a double P, for example, or double X, unless you're looking at movies. And that's triple X, isn't it, really? So we have to keep the letter X, otherwise who knows what you're going to end up watching by accident. Spain might have a 4-day working week. We should perhaps do the same thing here, although isn't it the case that much of Europe can do in 4 days what it takes us to do in 5? Except, of course, when it comes to vaccine rollouts. But there's a trial run that's expected to run in Spain, with companies recruited, a €50 million budget to cover companies the cost of setting up this scheme. But they reckon that just that, you can do in 4 days what you normally do in 5. So that's what they want to test. Labour tried a similar idea, didn't they, just before the 2019 election. It never took off. But actually, if you take full-time and part-time workers combined, the average hours worked in the UK has been decreasing. It's levelled off now, but it was over 21,000 hours each in 1950, down to 1,600 hours in the mid-noughties. But almost certainly because of more part-time workers. I think in the 1950s, there were no part-time workers. So you went to work full-time. You had to be a man with a wife at home and your own home. And that's the way it was back in the 1950s. Look, I've signed up to Deliveroo. I'm getting their prospectus for their IPO, which is in the offing sometime soon. The prospectus, I have to say, I was a little disappointed. I ordered it. I waited. I thought it would be here in half an hour. I'm very disappointed. Not impressed at all. But they're hoping to raise £1 billion by selling new shares on the London Stock Exchange. The tech media website Sifted said some early Deliveroo backers, these are the people who are at the beginning, so they've gone now. Too late for this. But some of them stand to make a 60,000% return. So let's see how it goes. I mean, you do think, you really lose if you get in early on an IPO. Although very often, a few days later, if you don't bail out, then you could have lost some money. But I wonder how well this is going to do, because the company made a $224 million loss last year, even though everyone was ordering food because lots of us realized we didn't know how to cook. And Amazon bought a big slice of them as well. And in their defense, because the regulator had to get involved in that because there was a question mark over whether that would be stopping competition, the answer they gave was that their business would fail if they didn't get the capital injection from Amazon. So that doesn't exactly fill you with confidence, does it really? And I wonder, how can they make a loss? Because they are making a loss. I mean, they pay very little to have people cycling around with a pizza strapped on their back. They charge delivery fees. I'm sure they take a cut from the restaurants, and it's all managed by an app. How do you make a loss out of that? Particularly when it's a growing market. An analyst at UBS said that the food delivery market could reach $400 billion by 2024 and $1 trillion in the next decade. But there we are. We will see how it goes, won't we? Now, look, just before the pandemic struck, in March 2020, there were 29 million people employed in the UK on payrolls. That fell pretty significantly to less than 28.4 million in June, then down to 28.1 million in November. Now, on the face of it, that doesn't sound too bad because it's a 3% drop, but it is also close to 1 million people who've lost their livelihoods, and it could get worse. Of course, the reality is that it probably will get worse. At the end of January, there were 4.7 million people on the government furlough scheme, and over its lifetime, the furlough scheme has been used by 11.2 million employees. These are staggering numbers, aren't they? So as the recovery begins, we hope the jobs are going to return, but how many will also disappear? Dr. Nicola Headlam joins me from Red Flag Alert, which is a business intelligence company that helps you look at things like credit risk, compliance, sales performance, all that sort of good stuff, the sort of stuff you do with data to make sure you're making the right decisions. So Dr. Headlam, you've been drilling down on the numbers of furlough workers, and you reckon an extra 275,000 people will be out of work when the furlough scheme ends.
Hi, and good morning, Phil. Thanks for having me. Yes, the numbers that you've talked about, I mean, they're just so eye-watering, aren't they? They're just such big numbers. I think that was the first feeling when the first sort of fiscal event to do with Corona happened. Rishi was a background as a trader. Everyone's quite delighted that he's not scared of those massive numbers, because quite a lot of chancellors in normal times.
Well, look, as a trader, he knows, look, if it gets difficult, the central bank can just create the money for us. Maybe that's part of it. Maybe he's got a...
Well, I don't know about your sources, but anyway. So Red Flag Alert, we combine different business databases to come up with our kind of secret sauce, which is 1, 2, 3 and red flag distress for companies, and gold, silver and bronze growth potential. So that's sort of our meat and drink. They brought me in because I've got a policy background and also an academic background, and I've looked for a long time at the use of that kind of data in planning and in economic development and in framing a policy response to, normal times or normal crises. So this is a challenge to absolutely everyone that is looking and thinking about how to do economic development in the economy.
So 275,000. I mean, it doesn't sound as bad as it could be, but it could be much worse, I guess. But it's still a big number to put on top of what's already a big number. So without getting too scientific, how did you arrive at that figure?
We were looking through and correlating furlough data, so coronavirus job retention scheme data from December, with underlying corporate health. That's been our main sort of pandemic response at Red Flag. And our most recent version of this data shows that 26 of the companies that made claims in December, and bear in mind that was 741,000 companies used the furlough scheme in December, are showing some signs of extremely poor financial performance. So of those 741,000, 193,000 are vulnerable to the risk of going out of business. So what we discovered was that 12,500 could go insolvent within 6 months of furlough ending, and that would be the 275,000 people unemployed figure. The thing is, there are also a smaller number of businesses, which is around 5,000, who are using furlough data, but they're already insolvent or very close to insolvency. So,
So I wonder whether we should have just actually let those companies, I mean, it sounds a bit callous, but let those companies go to the wall so that people could, explore new opportunities and new companies might emerge from this, rather than just maintaining zombie companies which are going to fail anyway. I mean, surely the government should have really been looking at that as well, shouldn't they?
So I think, to be fair to the Treasury, nobody could have forecast the fact that we've all been in our homes for a year. I think it's so unusual and so different. And the fact that furlough particularly has been about to be ended 3 or 4 times, and now we're looking at it ending in September. This is reacting to the reality of the virus and the lockdown. So in some ways, it's, we'll all have forever to pore over whether the decisions taken by the Treasury were right or wrong, but they were being taken in extremely real time in response to kind of a very clear and present issue. And I think that broadly, there has been quite a lot of protection of jobs, which is obviously the policy objective, but it's just very, very difficult to be able to tell how the zombie company thing that you talk about is talked about a lot, but there's an awful lot more kind of heat and light on that because we're not really certain. And as I say, even with our sort of X-ray into corporate health, so another massive set of numbers that we think there's about 103,000 businesses who maybe are surviving just because they've got cheap credit or government support.
Which means they've got debt. Now, I mean, if they've got credit, they've got debt, they've got to pay back, which means they've got to see their business recover enough to be able to pay back those debts. I mean, that could be a more long, slow, painful death for those companies, couldn't it? But we saw, of course, when the furlough, are we expecting that these companies, this number, this 275,000, is going to be after furlough ends, or what's going to happen before that? Because, of course, what we saw last year was when there was the likelihood that furlough was ending, and then of course it was extending. But before companies realised that it was going to be extended, we saw that massive increase in redundancies. We had 3 months to November, I think it was, we had 395,000, almost 400,000 people made redundant, which is the most ever. So this isn't quite as big as that, but of course we know we have more certainty about how long the furlough scheme is going to last, and we hope we're going to come out the other side with everyone vaccinated and the economy back on growth rather than the potential for more lockdowns. So are you expecting that this is all going to happen after the furlough ends, or are we going to see it starting now as companies realise that we are just not going to be able to make it through?
Well, the reason to extend the furlough is to extend and prolong that period, right? So, having all the pain at once isn't good for anybody. I think to be honest, I think it could, if we had 1 million job losses in one go, I think that could have really spooked both the markets, but also that's 1 million people, rather than claiming furlough and having a link to their employer, it's 1 million people trying to navigate the benefit system, or God forbid, it's incredibly difficult to do. So I think it's absolutely right to have a sort of tapered end to it. The issue comes though when you're looking, because it isn't just that businesses may be, struggling with high levels of indebtedness. There are also both spatial and sectoral issues that come into play. So what I mean by that is all places are not created equal in this country. And this is, my background looking at the north and the structural inequalities in the country. And really flying out of lockdown into 4% growth, I really don't think is feasible in every place.
I mean, some of that's obvious, isn't it, really? I mean, we know that any face-to-face business has been struggling, and a lot of them, I mean, you just need to look down your high street and see how many shops have closed, how many restaurants have closed. So, I mean, you hope someone's going to buy them back, but maybe not, because behaviour is going to change. It's going to be difficult to tell,
the thing is, you have
isn't
to
it?
remember as well, for every, face-to-face retail interaction, there is a supply chain that stretches. So recently, Bon Marché became insolvent, which is a shop. But the tentacles of that supply chain, it went into many, many sort of mills and people that are producing in this country. Effectively, supply chain effects start to then ramp up. I mean, that's the bit that's truly scary, is that you can lose, the death of the high street, which has been very much sort of exaggerated. Anything that's being sold face to face, links tens and hundreds of companies together. And that's something that we look at very closely in Red Flag Alert, is the contagion that moves from one business to the next.
So what sort of sectors then are being hit the hardest?
So the face-to-face sectors which are clear, so hospitality, quite clearly, if you can't open, then everybody's on furlough, and pubs and restaurants and all of that. I mean, obviously, some have found wonderful ways of modifying their business models and doing home delivery and stuff. But as a rule, hospitality and they have been forced to close, which is why they're able to claim government support. Now, in an industry which is not quite as obvious has been construction, and I suppose again that stands to reason, right? With such uncertainty in the market and in the economy, people aren't commissioning large-scale refurbishment or buildings. But what we've seen in construction is quite a lot of larger regional players looking extremely risky. And of course, the construction supply chain has a very long tail right into sort of self-employed, trades and sparkies and joiners and all that kind of thing, but all the way up to very, very large regional concerns. So construction is looking extremely worrying as a sector. Now, you say it's obvious that sort of spatial and social and sectoral consequences should be taken into consideration. This is actually a little bit of a sticky wicket for the government, because although they do have their plan for growth, which is, pulling together quite a lot of the policy, until recently they had an industrial strategy which was run out of BEIS, which was actually the Department for Business, Environment and Industrial Strategy, and under previous Secretary of State Greg Clark. They did look at advanced manufacturing, they did look at nanotechnology, they did look at all these kind of areas of competitive advantage for the future. And they also had local industrial strategies, so Greater Manchester working out its kind of economic strengths and then being able to kind of push them forward in a coherent fashion, so graphene, all the kind of, the regional assets. But the currently BEIS is not, they've dropped having the industrial strategy. They're even going to change the name of the department. And it seems very curious that at a time when you really need to be very clear about your sectoral and spatial decisions around who you're supporting and why, and a framework, and fine, it wasn't perfect framework, but it was a framework. Isn't that a
danger, though, that you are picking winners if you go down that approach? The government is picking. I know what you're saying, that we've got to have it was going to be one of my questions to you. How does the government develop a strategy on this, given that there is so much uncertainty? But they can't pick winners.
Governments always pick winners, implicitly or explicitly. And I think
how does it normally work out? That's the problem. How successful is it?
Well, the iPhone's not bad, and without the American government support, it wouldn't exist. That's the point, is that when governments do intervene, it feels very it's kind of unsexy in policy terms, right, to have lots of government intervention. But actually, most activity and most innovation in the market is supported somewhere along the line by government decisions. It's just that we're not used to describing that interaction. So what we've come to settle on a place where we believe that, all innovation and all invention and all that is sort of within companies, and the dead hand of government is this kind of dreadful regulatory, thing. It's not at all. Really successful governments, such as Germany, are much more interventionist in their economy at every level and at every scale. So BMW, for example, would not be the company that it is without the German state support. And also, that isn't just in terms of stimulus, that is in terms of a whole network of Fraunhofers, which combine apprenticeships and training and innovation. It's a different kind of, I think we're very queasy in this country, and that's sort of the narrative about, well, government can't pick winners. Government does through what it does, and also what it doesn't do. The problem is it struggles to articulate any of that in a way that, so certainly companies lack certainty. I mean, look at this Cumbrian coal mine. I mean, if you're an investor in that, you'd be feeling sick as a parrot due to change. The optics of politics are far too high in the mix, and a data-led recovery, which is what Red Flag would like to see, is a long way from the thing that gets you a headline or gets you a kind of quick decision. And that, sadly, losing our capacity to have industrial strategy and local industrial strategy embedded within it, and losing our capacity to think regionally or in more strategic ways about what the economy ought to be doing in different parts of the country. This is a problem. Is this
an opportunity, do you think, that where we actually see the future of the country? I mean, if we got this right, rather than us being completely dominated by the city, which obviously is what's happened in this country since the 1980s, that there's an opportunity because I don't know whether reindustrializing or certainly looking for new manufacturing or any industry, even if it's a service industry, any industry which is not the financial industry, which is going to help the rest of the country develop, would be a good outcome from all of this, wouldn't it?
Well, even financial services can be done in places other than the Golden Mile. You know what I mean? The thing is, you're absolutely right. In a kind of virtuous circle, we face this crisis, we innovate our way out of it, we grow our way out of it, we train our way out of it, and as a result, we end up with an industrial base which is more diversified, both in terms of the spatial consequences and in terms of sectors, not just financial services. And we have, and we all live happily ever after. Sadly, trends have been the opposite. And certainly most of the ways in which the Treasury have dealt with the crisis have been by gathering more and more around themselves. There was a more distributed version that could have been trialed. But then back to the German example, my old professor used to say, no country has ever become federal by accident. And it's perfectly true. It takes a political will to create centres outside of your capital. So like in France, they had a whole regionalisation process in the 80s and 90s, and it has succeeded to an extent. They do have areas of specialisation beyond Paris and Ile-de-France, which are a very EU kind of sounding thing, but smart specialisation. It's not picking winners per se, but it is strategic support to businesses and creating clusters and hubs. Because as we all know from economic geography, there are amazing knowledge spillovers to be had where businesses kind of cluster together, and where they cluster together with higher education and with. So yes. Thank you. We're going to have
economic complexity, they call it, don't they? Where you've got a complex mix of different businesses, and if they all work together, then you start to get new businesses emerging.
You certainly do.
That's how you get growth. But a final question for you before we go, because we're running out of time now. I mean, the great thing about podcasts is they are open-ended, sort of, but people have got lives. They're going to move on. What do you think about the approach that's taken in the US versus the approach that we've taken here then? So, because the feeling here, and we've heard it from the governor of the Bank of England, we've heard it from Rishi Sunak, that we've got all this money saved. There's enough people in the country who've saved enough money during this pandemic that they are going to go out and splash that money around, and that is going to help the economic recovery. I'm not so sure about that. I think if they have saved it, I think it's probably gone on their mortgage and it's not real savings. And if they, even if it's sitting in a bank account, I suspect they're going to have been so shocked by this whole process that they're going to want to hang on to it rather than splash out. Maybe a little bit, but not a great deal. Whereas obviously the US approach is that, well, let's just inject money into people's bank accounts and let's let jobs disappear. New ones will emerge because we are pushing through a stimulus that's going to get people spending. Which approach do you think is the best approach? Initially I was thinking, well, we've created this bridge, we're saving jobs, whereas the US is letting them disappear. And that might have been fine if it was 3 months. But now we're a year down the track. I'm looking and thinking, well, perhaps the US has taken the best approach here.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the US, because obviously there was Trump and Biden, and they had completely opposed views. So it was quite chaotic under President Trump, and there certainly wasn't a sense of. Both. The thing is, what's intriguing about American growth policy is that whilst they are the land of the free and government never does anything, both stimulus coming out of the banking crisis and this time have been multiple trillions. And, both times they've been the most money any government has ever spent on anything. So it sort of gives the lie to government can't pick and choose, because they have picked and chosen, and they've chosen this 1.9 trillion stimulus. And you're right. I guess you could typify it as saying that the Biden administration's approach has been to back people rather than businesses per se.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, it is a long way from where our Treasury has ended up. But as I've said earlier on, I think you can understand why the Treasury, because as you say, if it had been 3 months, then maybe. But the core thing underneath it all, which is why you need to look at data to properly flesh out policy options, is that the ways in which the economy is restructuring in the post-pandemic period. We could be making the new normal could be. People always say that the way that a city looks is all about how it came out of its last crisis, right? Because when there is excess capital, people spend then and create these kind of, a very specific style. So the Roaring '20s architecture, maybe, if it works. The thing is, there really are no right answers with this kind of scale of these are experiments being played out in real time on huge populations.
Yes, I think what you're saying is that in amongst all of this, then, there needs to be a plan. The government actually has to have a strategy.
A plan would be marvellous. And you know what? I think, again, in support of the Treasury, they've reacted and responded well to I've written and talked at great length about how, you have to plan mindful of the VUCA phenomenon, so volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and you need to be adaptive. So that kind of planning, it's not a rigid thing that never changes. So a good bit of VUCA thinking, but also underpinned, and I would say this, wouldn't I, the data in the economy leads you to policy options that maybe don't naturally sit in the head of a more free market politician or the head of a more Corbynite politician. We need to follow the data wherever it leads us, right? Because what is happening in the economy must be responded to properly.
Following the science. We keep on saying it when we're talking about the virus. Maybe we need to do it when we're talking about economics and statistics from business.
Wouldn't it be lovely? I mean, having we've had such a very long-running bias towards, frankly, half-arsing it, and I think it's time to really use the data. Yeah,
I love that technical term, half-arsing it. That's what we've been doing. Look, we should get you back on again, because I know you've been involved a lot in planning for the north of England, the Northern Powerhouse, and I'd like to talk to you about that at some point, but we'll leave it there for now. Thanks for coming on.
Anytime. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, that's Dr. Nicola Headlam from Red Flag Alert. It's not going to be an easy road, is it? I think she is right that there needs to be a bit more planning rather than this short-termism, which is understandable why we've got that. But now we need to be looking at the next wave, not the next wave of the virus, but the next wave for the economy, and how are we going to see it all grow back? Because we do know there's only one thing that we are absolutely certain of. It's not going to be exactly the same as it was back in March last year. Tomorrow, if you are running a business that has been closed down because of the lockdowns, how do you reopen? We've got some marketing advice. It's not just reopening, you need a relaunch. Listen in tomorrow for that one. That's it for today, though. Catch you tomorrow morning.
It's the Business with Phil Dobbie. Listen online at its.business or wherever good podcasts